This is the Big Issues BetterPod, acting today for a better tomorrow.
We know that poverty kills, basically. And so if we're going to get up front and keep people out of our NHS, needing treatment and so on, we need to really be tackling poverty. And that's, more difficult than ever at the moment.
For our first edition of BetterPod, we're talking to a woman who's at the cutting edge of the movement to act today for a better tomorrow. Sophie Howe is the world's first Future Generations Commissioner. She was appointed by the Welsh Government in 2016, and since then she's been working to change the way the state works, focusing on leaving future generations a planet and a society that's worth living in. I'm Laura Kelly, the Big Issues Future Generations editor. I lead a team of up-and-coming journalists who come from backgrounds that are all too often shut out of the media.
I'm Katerina Sivitanidis, and I'm a part of the Future Generations team. As someone that comes from a working class background and a mixed ethnic background, there's not many opportunities for people like me because journalism is considered an upper class job. So this opportunity here at The Big Issue is really important to me.
So Kat, tell me what struck you about our conversation with Sophie.
When we were talking to Sophie about topics that matter to young people, such as climate change and inequality, the one that struck me the most and the one that I relate to the most would be education. There's amount of times I remember in school when I was doing exams and I thought to myself, are the things that I'm learning about really mirroring real life? So when she spoke about reforming the education system in Wales for people under 14, I really think that the rest of the UK should take a look at that and really revamp our education system to benefit the future generations rather than failing them.
Hello, Sophie. Thanks for talking to Kat and me. As the Future Generations team at The Big Issue, we're delighted to begin our podcasting journey with you. If it's all right with you, I'd like to start a little bit about your background. So, as the first person in your family to go to university, you then became a local councillor at 21. You went on to work at the Equal Opportunities Commission and be a deputy police commissioner before taking on the historic role you now have. I would love to hear, where did that sense of self-assurance and drive come from, do you think?
Well, I mean, I look back, and maybe lots of people do this, but I look back on my life and, I don't know if you've seen that film Sliding Doors, when Gwyneth Paltrow goes to catch the train and then you run this sort of parallel film. One time she catches the train, the other one she doesn't catch the train, and basically her life kind of pans out in different ways. So I often think about what are those sliding door moments in your life, and there are probably loads, but two really kind of stick out to me. One is that I grew up in an area that was quite a tough area, often the headlines for the wrong reasons, all of the, deprivation statistics and all of those sorts of things. But actually my parents worked, and by virtue of the fact that my parents worked, I went to a school where my grandparents lived, which was in the leafy suburbs of Cardiff rather than this area. So instead of going to the school literally at the end of my street, which was like a twice failing school, I went to school in a more affluent area, and the aspirations of kids in that school were quite different to the aspirations of kids that I played with on the street and so on. So it was the norm for people to go to university, etc., etc. And so, I went through that system. I was the first in my family to go to university. And then in my dad was clearly she's going to be the next leader of the free world now because she's gone to university. This is amazing.
I like his attitude on that.
Yeah. And then I fell pregnant in my final year of university. And it was kind of again, that was a kind of sliding door moment for me, because what I was hit with then, even from my dad, who was the most proud dad ever, that's it, you've ruined your life, you're now just going to be another one of the statistics and so on and so on. And that really, I'm one of those people, if you tell me I can't do something, by God, I'm going to do it. Or if you tell me that there's, a sort of barrier or a blocker. So that made me even more determined. So that bump as it was then, he's now 22. And, I suppose I then both had that determination, that kind of, I always had that sense of social justice, that comparison between like the aspiration of the kids in school versus the kids that I played with on the street, and why should their lives be different, just dependent on, you know, where they were born or where they went to school. And of course, then I had like my own, you know, child to think, God, I've got to like, you know, I've got to do well for him and do better for him. And so I was elected as a councillor when I was 6 months pregnant. I'm not sure whether I would have done that, you know, if, you know, before, or if I'd known that I was pregnant when I got selected and so on. But that also gave me this insight into, wow, we really need to be like getting up front of lots of problems, and, you know, really need to be bringing in different perspectives to some of those political environments that just don't generally, certainly not back then, they just didn't exist.
With that backstory, it kind of feels like the job you're in now, Future Generations Commissioner, it feels sort of almost like you were destined to do it. But tell us a bit about what that actually means for people who maybe don't, have a great understanding about what that role is.
The role was set up when the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd, passed this law, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it does a number of things. So I suppose the most important thing is that it places this legal duty on all of our main institutions in Wales, so like our councils, our health boards, our fire and rescue services, things like that, our public services, and the Welsh Government itself, to demonstrate how when they're taking decisions, and they take decisions in a way which meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so that's how that role came about, and it's first in the world. Which is very exciting. I think, you know, can be a bit lonely, you know, I'm just, you know, hanging out on my own in the world, being the only commissioner. But there are others coming now. There's one in Gibraltar. There's going to be one in Scotland soon. If we can get this UK bill through that is being led by you guys and John Bird in the House of Lords, then that would be absolutely huge as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
As the commissioner, how do you possibly work out what's actually best for the future?
I can't with 100% certainty, can I say what future generations want, you know, because we're talking about the unborn here, and, you know, not surprisingly, they don't talk to me that much. So what we did in Wales is we basically had this like national conversation where we asked the citizens of Wales, what's the Wales you want to leave behind to your children and your grandchildren and future generations to come? And they came up with, you know, quite a load of like what are really sensible things. We want like a healthier Wales where everyone's physical and mental health is sort of maximised and their well-being is protected. We want to protect our environment. We want, you know, a planet, or, you know, a Wales and a planet that's going to be left behind for future generations. We want an economy that, you know, addresses inequality, not one that just kind of strives for just, you know, growth forever and ever, whatever the consequences. So I think when you pose those questions to people, you know, what's this world going to be like for your next generations and those yet to come, you do actually get some quite sensible answers.
Do you think it's important for you and those that you see in power more generally to listen to young people and listen to what they have to say?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, our young people, well, they're not, you know, the unborn, are they? But they're closer to the unborn. They're closer to knowing what a future will look like. And one of the things that I'm doing is I've set this thing called a Future Leaders Academy. Mm-hmm. So we've got every year a cohort of 30 future leaders, and, you know, we put them through an intensive program about leadership in their sort of sector. So they're, you know, we've got engineers, we've got people who work in the environment sector, we've got young creatives, we've got people who are real community activists and so on. And we sort of, you know, upskill them on, you know, leading in their sector around the Future Generations Act and sustainability. But the really exciting bit is we also get them to mentor current leaders in Wales. So our future leaders are, you know, it's usually the other way around, isn't it? Us older people, we must impart our great knowledge onto younger generations. What absolute nonsense, because there's so much that our younger generations need to teach us and the sort of current leaders. So they're mentoring, like, you know, the head of the Welsh Government Civil Service, they're mentoring the chief executive of the Welsh Football Association, chief executive of the health boards, because we need that perspective that just doesn't really exist in decision making at the moment.
I love that programme. I've read about that and I thought it's just fantastic. Obviously, that's one of the ways that you can encourage the governments and political establishment more generally to act today for tomorrow. But and you've got the Act and you've got yourself there. But I'm aware that those are all kind of structural bits and pieces that you can put in place. How do you see the kind of the real work of embedding that thinking in the way people, actually do their day-to-day jobs rather than being an add-on?
Yeah, and so that is the absolute critical question, isn't it? Because really it's quite easy to pass a law, and a law generally requires you to do specific, often bureaucratic things. You've got to write a wellbeing plan and do wellbeing assessments, and you've got to report on it once a year, and and all of those sorts of things. And often when we have those things, you get people like ticking the box and completely missing the point. And so I've tried to be really careful as the sort of first Future Generations Commissioner to not get obsessed about the bureaucracy of it all, because I think that can completely take you away from the point of it. And so a lot of what I try and do is sort of, show people how can we do things in a better way. So like one of the programmes we've been working with, we got a public health consultant seconded to Cardiff Council to lead on the development of the transport strategy. And that's really interesting because when you start applying a public health lens to a transport problem, you kind of get a completely different set of solutions. You ask the highways department, right, what they'll do is build you a road. And what that road will do is cause more air pollution. People will still be sitting in their cars, not travelling actively in a healthy way, and so on and so on. So you put the public health guy in there, and what you start then seeing is, right, we're going to target active travel and public transport investment at our communities who've got the lowest levels of life expectancy, because if we have the infrastructure in those communities to reduce air pollution, to get people travelling in a healthier way, that has long-term benefits to the kind of health outcomes for those communities. And so, like we call it in our team, what we're trying to do is like build a movement. And I think that's what you guys are trying to do in the big issue, really, from a UK perspective, build this movement around, one, let's call out the madness. The way we're doing things at the moment is completely mad.
Yeah.
So short term, storing up all these problems and so on. 2, set out a vision for there's a better way of doing it. And 3, let's get a law to require our government to do things in a better way.
Coming up after this message, why does Sophie think a universal basic income could be a game changer? Did you know you can get the Big Issues award-winning journalism through your door every week? As a BetterPod listener, you can sign up to get a 4-week subscription to the best in news, politics and culture for just £12. And we'll even throw in a stylish tote bag for free. Go to bigissue.com/bigpod to find out more.
You've been in the role for 6 years now, which is incredible. What do you think are some of the biggest successes you've seen?
So I suppose that the sort of first biggest test case was a plan for the government to, they wanted to use all of Wales's borrowing capacity. So it's a bit of a kind of quirk of the devolution settlement. The Wales didn't have powers to borrow money like the UK government has. And they just got these powers to borrow money, and they wanted to borrow all the money that they could borrow to build a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion on the M4 around Newport. And I said, hang on a minute, how have you considered the well-being of future generations in this? Because we've got these goals to reduce our carbon emissions. We've got goals for a healthier Wales. How is having everyone sat in their cars on a motorway going to keep anyone healthier and reduce air pollution? It's going to increase our carbon emissions. How is it going to deal with our goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't even own a car? So you'd literally be spending all of the money for those who are already better off. And the government couldn't, I challenged them on that. I really publicly sort of challenged and embarrassed them, really. And they couldn't answer those questions. And the First Minister changed that decision. So that's one decision, but that was a kind of trigger point for us being able to show you've got to change the whole system. So now on transport in Wales, we reform the transport strategy. So now building roads is right at the bottom of the list of priorities in our transport strategy. So you can see there how from one intervention, that's sort of had a trickle effect. But then there's more. We've revised our school curriculum. in Wales around the Future Generations Act. So, what we were doing is basically, regurgitating knowledge to kids for them to then, regurgitate back. Utter nonsense in a world where if you want to know something, you Google it. And that's now, in the future, we might just, I don't know, think it and it'll pop into our head through some sort of, weird chip or something, who knows. So what we need to be teaching our kids is the things that robots can't do. Empathy, critical thinking, cooperation, teamwork, all of those sorts of things are going to be needed for them to live good lives, but also for them to be part of being good citizens.
Yeah, thanks in part to your advocacy for universal basic income. I know Wales has just launched a basic income pilot for care leavers. What do you make of that study?
So I'm really excited about it. We know that poverty kills, basically. And so if we're going to get up front and keep people out of our NHS, needing treatment and so on, we need to really be tackling poverty. And that's, more difficult than ever at the moment. The cost of living crisis, hundreds of thousands of people being tipped into poverty and so on. And I don't think that, our welfare system was devised in a completely different time. It was devised in a time when, the gig economy wasn't a word, that wasn't a thing. So you might have been, you'd leave school and you'd go into work and you'd probably stay in the same job or the same field throughout your career. Now, you could be earning 50 quid one week as a Deliveroo, driver, or, 300 quid the next week. And the welfare system doesn't really kind of account for that. And it's still keeping people in poverty. So if we want to do better things for the next generation, we need to take them, the current generation and children sort of coming behind, we need to take them out of poverty. So I think, that a universal basic income should be an issue that we're looking at. It costs a lot of money, but it costs less money than dealing with the effects of poverty cost. So again, it's a mindset shift. So there's all sorts of complicated reasons to do with devolution, why it's difficult for the Welsh Government to roll it out completely. And the UK Government are not particularly supportive of that, which is particularly difficult because we need their cooperation to do that. What we don't want is for the Welsh Government to be given a universal UBI on one hand, and then the UK Government to be taking away other benefits because of that income, if you see what I mean. So they're going to trial it with care leavers, which I think is a good start. Undoubtedly, care leavers are some of the most disadvantaged people in society. And we're going to see what happens. We're going to see whether their health improves, whether their prospects of work and so on improve, whether their overall well-being improves. And where there have been pilots in other countries, there have been some amazing results there. So I'm really excited to get going in Wales.
If you had a magic wand, what policies would you wave into today?
Okay, well, I think can I pick two then? Well, there's loads actually, but I'm going to pick two. So I'd have a full rollout of a universal basic income.
Yeah.
And then I'm passionate about our education system and what that's doing for, or sometimes sadly to, our kids. And so we've done really well in Wales reforming the curriculum up to age 14. But once we get to age 14, we've still got GCSEs. And I've got a 16-year-old going through GCSEs at the moment. And so all of the exciting thing that I just told you about with our pre-14 curriculum falls off the edge of a cliff at age 14, because then we're just teaching to the test. And I went to sort of parents' evening for my son Jude a few months ago. Actually, this was like January, and they were like, oh, right, what we're doing now, we finished the curriculum, we're just revising. And I was like, are you actually kidding me? You're going to be spending 4 months literally just teaching to a test. He's got to, learn to almost like remember poems. When in your life do you ever need to remember poems? I just cannot fathom it. So what we need is a complete reform of our examination system, because it's driving just completely the wrong sort of actions in school. And instead, what we should be doing is equipping young people with sort of skills for life and skills for work. Someone said to me the other day, a young woman who just finished her degree, she said, you know what? She said, in everything that I do now, I would never sort of really do it on my own. We're always doing it in a team, and we're bouncing ideas off each other. And yet your entire school life and examination life, you're basically told, don't talk to anyone else. Just sit there and regurgitate knowledge by yourself. And when do you ever need to do that? Crazy. So examination reform for me.
I really love that you say that, because there's been so many times in school. I remember I left school about 5 years ago, and whereas Shakespeare's great, but I just was doing English and I was thinking to myself, when am I ever going to remember any of these quotes? Yeah, definitely. Do you think a small country like Wales can make a difference on the kind of big questions and big issues today, like climate change?
Yeah, I think, we often get that sort of question, don't we? Members of the public say to us, well, God, what's the point of us doing this? Because, you've got China with all their emissions, you've got the US, with all of their emissions and so on and so on. But I think I heard this really interesting quote, which is like, defeatism is the new denialism on climate. And I think that's absolutely right. And we should all bear that in mind. And I think that, often what the small nations do is often more progressive, and other bigger nations start to follow. So back when, do you remember when Donald Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Accord? And, that was, terrible thing to do. But actually, many of the states in the US said, hang on a minute, we're not pulling out, and we're the people who actually hold the levers on how we plan our transport, how we build our houses, how we grow our food, how we do all of these sorts of things. And those are going to be the things that are going to make the difference in tackling climate change. And so that's where I think a small nation can, really add value, because we tend to be a bit more connected, we tend to be a bit more nimble and flexible, and we can make things happen, and we tend to be a bit more progressive as well, a lot more progressive, I'd say, in Wales's case. And if we look at kind of what we're doing, Wales is a world leader on this future generations legislation, and my office and with other colleagues, we've been working with the United Nations to say, you need to be advocating on behalf of future generations. What can we do at a UN level? And at the beginning of this year, the UN Secretary General announced that the UN will have a special envoy for future generations, which is like the UN equivalent of a commissioner, a declaration for future generations, which is like the UN equivalent of a Future Generations Act, and reform their own governance infrastructure. And I met with them last week, and they're looking to get that in place by September 2023. Now, that's kind of modelled on Wales. And we are a tiny country of just over 3 million people. So if you ever think you're too small, you can look at Greta Thunberg and the movement that she developed from one lone person standing outside the Swedish Parliament. And you can look at Wales as a tiny nation, well punching above its weight at a UN level, and potentially leading to reforms for future generations in every country across the world. Boom, go on, Wales.
Yeah. If you aren't inspired by that one, what do you want? Every week in the podcast, we are also asking each of our guests 3 questions that can hopefully help our listeners act today for a better tomorrow. So, Kat, will you do the honours for the first time?
So, firstly, what's one bit of advice that you wish you'd known earlier?
I think this is sort of a bit of a life motto that I try and stick by now, and it's feel the fear and do it anyway. So in everything that I've, in my life and career that I've absolutely, grown to love and been absolute, core to me and what I want to do, I've been absolutely terrified of it. I was terrified of having a baby. I was terrified of public speaking. I was terrified of taking on this role, because I was thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do it? How are we going to, and you've just got to put yourself out there, and you've got to have, you've got to embrace failure, because you will fail. And you learn from that and you pick yourself back up. But whenever you put yourself out there and you do things you're scared of, it generally works out never as bad as you thought it was going to be, and you grow from it. And, even better, this is the mission, other things grow from it, and hopefully you're sort of making change and improvement. So that would be my advice.
What's one bit of art that gives you hope for the future?
So I'm going to choose a piece of music that some of our young creatives in Wales have just been working on. So it's an artist called Blankface and Saskia Pay. And they have done this amazing music based around kind of communicating the Future Generations Act.
And finally, what's one thing that our listeners could do today to make tomorrow better?
So I suppose whenever people get asked that question, you can point to 1,000,001 things, can't you, about, acting more sustainably in the way you go about, buying things, not buying things, food waste, your environmental impact, all of those things. And all of those things are really, really important. But I do also believe that, sometimes it's in the interests of governments and the big corporates to be really pinning all of that back on the individual. And actually, whilst it is important that we all play our part in this, it's more important, and what governments do and what big corporate companies do have the biggest impact on, on our futures, and particularly on addressing the climate emergency. So, I would say that actually lobbying your MP, your local politicians, your local council around how are you acting in the interests of future generations. If it's your MP and you live in England, or indeed, the UK, because it's a UK Future Generations bill, ask them if they're backing the bill. And if they're not, ask them why not. Why are they not interested in your future and the future of your children and grandchildren? And what's their rationale for that? So I think it's this whole thing around like building a movement, and, a movement starts with one person, doesn't it? And then it grows and grows.
We hope you enjoyed the first edition of BetterPod. If you'd like to support us, we'd love if you would subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and please do leave a review. We're relying on word of mouth to bring people into our conversation and to help us all discover how we can act today for a better tomorrow.
You can keep up with all of the Big Issues reporting at bigissue.com, where you can also discover how to find your local magazine vendor.